as part of a series jointly put together by the Woodrow Wilson Center and George Mason University, called Managing Our Planet. And its basic premise is that some of the forces of change are global in scale. So we like to look at things at scale and not just the challenges, but also the solutions. And I think we've been talking about an island focus for quite some time now, and it's really great to see it come together this afternoon. So as a biologist, islands are automatically interesting because it's much easier to understand what's going on in a confined space of an island than it is in a great sort of continental stretch of landscape or seascape, for that matter. And so it is no accident that Darwin and Wallace's contribution to creating the principle of natural selection for evolution came directly from their experience with islands. So having tipped my hat to the biological side of all of this, we need to get back to the serious challenges that islands face today. We've got a great panel, and I would only say that I was really thrilled in Paris when finally the small island states got the attention they deserve, and good for them. So our first speaker, and I think we'll sort of aim for like 15 minutes, is that okay? You planned for longer, or no? And so that way there'll be time for some questions after each presenter for specific things, and then we'll at least have half an hour of open discussion. So Kate Brown is the executive director of the Global Island Partnership. And I could read the text here, but this is really a global island partnership. It is so widely connected to everything that goes on to do with islands that it's truly admirable. So Kate is somebody who works, outside of government dimensions, back and forth with governments, intergovernmentally, basically whatever it takes to advance the interests of the Global Island Partnership. So Kate, please take it away.
Thanks. Should I sit here?
Wherever you like.
Okay, I can sit here. Oh, that's on. Great, thank you. It's really great to be here, actually, and to be with lots of people who are very familiar to me. So definitely there's a lot of people that care about islands in the Washington, D.C. area, and hopefully further in the world. I'm going to actually focus on two different things. One is I'm from the Pacific region, and I thought it would be good to share some Pacific region things. One of those is that a month ago, the Pacific region actually, the heads of government at the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting adopted a new framework for resilient development in the Pacific, which was really bringing together kind of the two different spaces, climate change and disaster risk reduction, which were operating in two kind of channels and have started to come together. There's now a new voluntary guidelines for organisations, governments, private sector, communities and NGOs in the Pacific really focused on the issue of resilient development and what that means. And I think they have three strategic goals, and that touches a little bit on what the two ambassadors talked about earlier. One is really looking at the issue of strengthening adaptation and risk reduction to enhance resilience to climate and disasters. And the second is looking at low carbon development, so the issue of that issue. And the third is really about how to strengthen disaster preparedness, response and recovery. And I think at the same time that this has been launched, a whole set of resources and efforts by regional agencies in the Pacific around resilient food systems, water systems and coasts have also been put out into the world. And I think what's really interesting about this, the Pacific is a really good example of a region that has a long history of working together very successfully. And in this, and I think that is really also part of the island innovation space, this idea that where we share common problems, we can share common solutions together. And so this voluntary guidelines, I think, is really exciting. And the second part of that, I think, is that when the leaders endorse the strategy, they also endorse the start of a new working group focused on the implementation of the strategy. So there's a new resilience working group in the Pacific looking, it hasn't formed, but there's a working group to look at forming this partnership on resilience in the Pacific. So there's a new partnership on resilience in the Pacific, which I think will really bring attention to how we take all of these international policy things, including the outcomes of COP21 and the Sustainable Development Goals, and look at actually implementing them both at the regional level, but most particularly at national and community level. And as many people might know, the Pacific region has a particular governance space around who owns the resources in that region, and I think has long tried to figure out how to deliver things that are impactful at community level, which is where resources are owned. And I think when we look at this new framework, it's really tried to address some of those issues. How do we deliver successfully some of these things that we're talking about, and we might understand what resilience means at a national level, but what does that mean to people actually trying to go about their lives in some of these islands? So I think that's a really significant new thing going out there. And I think one of the exciting things I think about this panel and the panel before that is that we're starting to see, also with Paris, that people outside of the island community are starting to understand that islands are great innovators. They have a lot to offer. The isolation issue is really important, but what we've really seen in our partnership started 10 years ago, and I think we're actually a good example of islands innovating. We were started by two presidents of two small island developing states, Seychelles and Palau, and we're now led by the Prime Minister of Grenada, the President of Seychelles, the President of Palau, and the Premier of the British Virgin Islands. The idea is, how do we bring islands together to identify some of these solutions and share some of the solutions to the issues that face island communities and island governments? I think we focus very much on the idea of how to mobilize high-level political will and island commitments and action on resilience and sustainability. So that's what this partnership is focused on. How do we strengthen partnerships at all levels? So national partnerships, regional partnerships, and partnerships interregionally. And we're not a partnership focused on small island developing states, although that is where we started. About a month ago, the governor of Hawaii joined the state of Hawaii to this partnership, and so we have members that are in Hawaii. Maxine actually talked about some of our members from Hawaii. The idea is, how do we learn from each other? How do we inspire each other to do more as island people? And then how do we support implementation when people have really gone out to do things? And some things like the debt swap that Seychelles has done is a really good example of how this partnership can pull together with members of the partnership, for example, the Nature Conservancy, to move something that is really difficult for one organisation or one country to do by itself. And that's really the space that the Global Island Partnership works on. What are the things that by working together we can actually achieve action on? We also really help members strategize around bringing global attention to and support for island solutions and initiatives. So there's been a lot of mobilization at international events. We're very focused on bringing solutions or bright spots. We're focused on sharing what is working on islands and showing, providing a platform for political leaders to make political commitments to something that they're actually going to implement. So the accountability of those commitments is very much within the partnership itself. We are trying to create a peer group of leaders that care about the issue of resilience and sustainability and who are out there in the world encouraging the rest of the world and other islands to kind of work together with them. And I think one of the exciting things in terms of islands working together, kind of related to international processes, but kind of independent of those in some ways, is these multi-country initiatives that many islands are a part of and have been taking part in for the last 10 years. And that's really looking at how they build resilience in terms of natural capital. So some of those are looking at, for example, the Micronesia Challenge, and people might have heard of that. It's been around for 10 years. It's the 10-year anniversary of that. That was inspired by the President of Palau writing to other leaders in Micronesia, in 4 other Micronesian countries and territories, to say what can we commit ourselves to doing as a result of our international policy on biodiversity and islands that was being developed at the same time. And they committed 10 years ago to conserving 20% of their nearshore and 30% of their terrestrial resources by 2020. And so that's interesting because it's led to mobilising resources, mobilising their domestic resources. It's changed the nature of the conversation that they have with the world. They're committing themselves to kind of very ambitious goals and targets. And it's led to the development of a 9-country, but it's growing, regional challenge in the Caribbean Challenge Initiative. And also one in the Western Indian Ocean, and also in Hawaii. Hawaii has a challenge called the Aloha Plus Challenge. I encourage you to look on the website of the Aloha Plus Challenge. That's the most recent challenge, and that one is really looking at the issue of sustainability and resilience together. And some of the things that we heard in the earlier sessions about how you look at things outside of a sectoral approach, but looking at things in a more intersectoral approach. We are working very much to kind of take some of these models to other parts of the world. I wanted to actually, on the Caribbean Challenge, I was actually just in St. Lucia about a week ago, and there's been enormous progress. So they committed to sustainably managing 20% of the Caribbean's marine and coastal ecosystems by 2020. So there's 9 countries doing that. And the Secretariat actually is hosted in Grenada. Since 2013, when they had a summit in the British Virgin Islands, there's been huge progress, actually. It was really inspiring. It was really exciting to hear all of the countries reporting on what they're doing in terms of increasing their achieving this goal that they've set themselves. And at the same time, it's led to the development of a regional biodiversity fund, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, which when it started in about 2013, there were 4 conservation trust funds at national level in the Caribbean. 2 weeks ago, there's been 9 more national level trust funds launched in the Caribbean that are legally established. And in the next year or so, another one will establish. So that's really looking at how do you deliver resources at a very local level? What resources can countries themselves put in and leverage other investment? And how can they benefit from pooling resources and looking at their investment portfolio? So these are really different kinds of thinking for the conservation space in islands. There's also one very similar in Micronesia that supports the Micronesia Challenge called the Micronesia Conservation Trust, looking at many of the same issues, and they're very much learning from each other. We actually did a side event at the World Conservation Congress recently with both of those funds, and they were sort of saying to each other, well, you're getting more money than my fund. But the idea is that they're also learning from each other. So there's some form of what we call in our partnership cooperative competition. They're cooperating, but they're kind of in competition, and we see that all throughout the partnership. And our role as in coordinating this partnership is to try and help people see that within the partnership. I think we also launched at the World Conservation Congress a month ago an initiative which was launched by the President of Palau, looking at scaling island models. How do we share some of these island models with other places? And we're actually working at the moment with UNDP Small Grants Program in the Pacific to look at some models, for example, what has happened in Hawaii, things like in the Caribbean and in Micronesia, how those could be applicable at a country scale. So really taking and trying to scale up across multiple spaces. I think the interesting thing about this, and it touches a little bit on what Valerie was talking about, is kind of how we help islands think a little bit about how they can address some of these issues of investment and how this might help them to do that. So I think we're really excited about what we can learn from this, and the idea in this partnership that we need to do more commitments that are focused on the resilient sustainability space, which we are going to do as we move forward. I wanted to also touch on, I think so that's kind of collaboration at the global level on islands. So we look very much from about 1,000 miles out in space down at what's going on. But in the Pacific, one of the things I thought would be useful just from a collaboration space, and also the idea of islanders really trying to help themselves and not waiting for people to help them, was the launch in Paris, along with all the progress on the outcomes of a thing called Pacific Rising, which was launched by Kiribati government and 3 other low-lying atoll countries, including Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Tokelau. And that's really looking at what they call a Marshall Plan for the Pacific, but how do they come together as atoll countries who, as we heard in earlier things, have a existential threat. At current scenarios, in 50 years, they may not have a livable island space. So instead of kind of being out there, what they're really thinking about is how do they create resilience for themselves in that space? And it's not necessarily going to be about some of the things that make sense in other places. So they're really looking at the capacity of people in these atolls. They're looking at technological solutions, and they're trying to share amongst themselves. So that was launched also in Paris, and I think it joins this huge range of partnerships and initiatives that islands have been mobilizing out in the world that are trying to make a difference to their situation, and which they're also actively reaching out to other people to provide a shared platform. So with the idea that if one succeeds, we will all succeed, we need to help each other. And I think that's really the underlying philosophy of our partnership. It's really about the idea that none of us can do any of this by ourselves. We need to strategize together, and we need to think about what are the few things that collectively we can do something about, while people in their countries and their organizations can continue to implement a range of other things. In the partnership, we're really focused on a few things that we can succeed on together, and really creating an island movement globally, regionally, and wherever that makes sense. Because we think, as we hear from Roger Mark and others, that islands are a great opportunity for people to learn from in the world. And that connection, while we're starting to hear it being said, isn't always there. I still think there's a lot of thinking that islands are defined by their size, and I think that's really unfortunate. So we need to define islands by their ambition and by what they're trying to do. And I think once we start doing that, we're going to see a lot of change. Thank you.
Thank you. So any quick clarifying question for Kate? If not, we'll go on to Shireen de Souza, who is a Foreign Affairs officer at the State Department, where she leads the Climate Change Adaptation Team. No small set of responsibilities. And she works with the UN Framework Convention, and most notably is co-chair of the Convention's Executive Committee on Loss and Damage. And I could go on, but I think what we really want to do is hear what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Tom. Is it automatically on?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today and to join the discussion. It's been great to hear the perspectives of all of the panelists so far. And thanks, Kate.
Just move it a little more central.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll speak for a few minutes about my State Department perspective on what I think are some of the good practices that SIDS are pioneering in the climate space. And I want to focus on 3 areas in particular. The first is the diplomatic weight that SIDS have demonstrated in the climate negotiations. Secondly, some of the homegrown solutions that SIDS have developed to deal with some of the capacity constraints that are typical in small countries. And then finally, one of the approaches that SIDS are taking in relation to human mobility concerns. So I'll say from the outset that my experience is more focused on the Pacific, and I know my colleague John from USAID will be speaking quite a bit about the Caribbean, so I'm going to focus mainly on the Pacific. Starting with the topic of SIDS and multilateral diplomacy, I'd say that there are quite a few lessons that the global community can learn from the SIDS based on the role that they've played in the climate negotiations. In many ways, the Pacific region, home of 3 of the world's 4 atoll countries, has taken their particular vulnerability and translated it into prominent leadership roles in the global effort to tackle the climate challenge. This was very obvious in the lead up to Paris, and even in the creation of the Durban mandate that led us to Paris. It was SIDS using their moral voice to say, we can't wait any longer. We need a global agreement that involves action by all to address this crisis that we, as SIDS, are facing. It was precisely this push by the SIDS that encouraged all countries to come along, to move beyond the comforts and constraints of a 1992 system that was clearly no longer adequate for addressing the magnitude of the crisis. This leadership was evident in the creation of the influential High Ambition Coalition, spearheaded by the Republic of the Marshall Islands in particular. This broad coalition of developed and developing countries came together in the lead up to Paris to push for an iterative upward spiral when it comes to emissions reduction commitments, a strong transparency system, and even early entry into force of the agreement, which we are seeing triggered today with us hitting the second of the 2 thresholds for entry into force. Super exciting and many years ahead of schedule. The SIDS were also the drivers behind a strong and meaningful outcome on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, and one on which the US and a few other developed countries worked very closely with the SIDS. This year, you see the Pacific SIDS, including through the High Ambition Coalition, again taking leadership roles in the Montreal Protocol discussions on HFC phase down, and in the International Civil Aviation Organization discussions on a market-based approach that would allow the international community to make even more progress toward keeping us below dire levels of warming. So what can we learn from the SIDS approach to playing this outsized role in multilateral diplomatic fora? I think one lesson is that size doesn't matter, especially when you have a strong moral voice and there are effective coordination mechanisms like AOSIS for coming together in a coalition format. Another lesson is around pragmatic leadership. And I'll point as an example, again, to the Marshall Islands and specifically to Ambassador Tony DeBroom, who, just to give you an example, back in 2013, the Marshall Islands hosted the Pacific Islands Forum. And Ambassador DeBroom and the rest of the leadership there basically brought together all of the PIF members, as well as a number of observer countries like the US, created the Madro Declaration and got all of the PIF members and a number of observers to sign on and inscribe emission reduction commitments. And this was basically a way of showing that the Pacific Islands, even though they were these tiny little countries, weren't going to wait for others to take the lead. They were going to lead by example. And of course, this is pragmatic leadership in that this has a real tangible benefit that both, I think, Ambassador Jumeau and Ambassador Friday spoke about in terms of moving towards clean energy, renewable energy, and given that the average price per kilowatt hour associated with imported fossil fuels is around 40 cents. And this is an incredible drain on the economies of these small countries. Okay, turning now to this, the other topic I want to talk about is a couple of the good models that SIDS have developed for building resilience in the context of small, low-capacity countries. And these are, number one, the use of regional organizations for spreading the capacity burden that adaptation often poses for countries. And the other is the use of central climate committees to enable coordination, especially with donors. So in terms of the regional organizations, the Pacific has quite a few. There's SPREP and SBC, PIFs, and probably others, right?
PIFs, yeah, there's like 9.
Okay, there's 9, right?
There's a word salad of letters. Yeah, okay.
And it seems that it's not always easy or seamless to get these regional organizations to work together well and to take coherent approaches. That said, organizations like SPREP, Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, house the technical capacity to support member states in everything from data collection to vulnerability assessments to social and environmental impact assessments, and very importantly, on how to access finance from bilateral and multilateral sources. For a country of 10,000 people or even 100,000 people, to build and maintain the capacity to do all of that themselves would be a huge challenge. With the regional organization model, donors can invest in building the capacity of regional organizations that they know will serve all of the 10 or 12 or 15 countries in their remit. One example of this regional approach supported by the State Department as well as USAID is a program called Adapt Asia Pacific, which basically works through the regional organizations to help Pacific SIDS access and manage multilateral adaptation finance. And this includes both the LDCF, the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and now including the Green Climate Fund. And already this program has helped Pacific SIDS access over $70 million from the multilateral funds. The other practical approach that the Pacific SIDS are spearheading relates to the use of central coordinating committees with buy-in from several relevant ministries to be the single point of coordination for donors and multilateral entities that work on climate change in the country. For many small countries, several donors and development partners want to work in a country at a given time, and as one of my Pacific SIDS counterparts said to me, development partners come in and they want to do the same vulnerability assessment that another partner just did. It's hard to say no, given the power dynamics, and it takes a ton of staff time just to engage with these actors in the first place. Vanuatu, a few years ago, set up a central climate committee that would be the single point of contact for implementing entities interested in working in the country. This allowed the country to take the lead in deciding what the country's priorities were, rather than being responsive to donors' interests. And it also gave the country the ability to say to development partners that they need to coordinate with each other if they wanted to work in the country, rather than potentially replicating and duplicating each other's efforts. This is, of course, a valuable lesson for donors and development organizations working in a given country. And it's also an approach that is of value to many developing countries, especially given the proliferation of organizations interested in working on climate change. Just quickly before I close, I want to briefly touch on one last topic, human mobility. And for some of the Pacific Island countries, sea level rise poses a threat that requires really extraordinary measures. The approach that Kiribati is taking with the Migration with Dignity strategy is one that I think warrants more attention. Recognizing that people will have to move, the policy focuses on building workforce capacity to help Kiribati citizens migrate to other countries that would be favorable to absorbing skilled workers. These immigrants would help strengthen a remittances economy, which would help Kiribati invest further in resilience building and economic development. This is certainly not an easy solution. It's a very complicated one, and in many ways a very sad one. And another aspect of Kiribati's approach has been to purchase land in Fiji. So it's not simply about just workforce development and building a skilled labor force, but it's a quite comprehensive approach. Just to highlight that this is a type of transformational approach that may be applicable and replicable in other contexts as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. So I think we can go straight on to John Furlow, who has already had a little drum roll in terms of his Caribbean orientation. Climate change specialist in impacts and adaptation at USAID. And a long set of accomplishments, but let's hear from you. And I invite the panel to sit in front where we can see things more easily.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Roger, Mark, and everyone for inviting me. As Shireen said, I'm going to talk a little bit about experiences that we've had or that I've had working with several different Caribbean island countries. Our theme is what can we learn from islands and how is it relevant elsewhere? And let me start by saying that I have learned so much working with colleagues and partners in the Caribbean that a lot of what I know about adaptation came from working in the island environment and really learning, testing what works and what doesn't, and getting I've learned a tremendous amount working in the islands. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the background of what we've done because I think I've presented on a lot of this here in the past. I'm happy to answer questions later if it seems like I'm glossing over too much. I'm going to start with some work that I did with our regional mission in the East Caribbean. We were working with, I think, about 4 or 5 East Caribbean countries, members of the Organization for East Caribbean States, plus Barbados, starting in, I think, in 2010. And we were trying to develop a program for our regional mission that would help the partner countries see where climate was interrupting their development goals. Roger Mark brought up the issue that was raised in Jamaica about corruption. We realized that climate would only be one of a number of impediments to development. And this was in 2000, either 9 or 10. So right as we were just beginning to crawl out of the economic crisis. So we decided to bring multiple stakeholders from each country together. We met in St. Lucia and then again in Barbados. And rather than starting with a vulnerability assessment or discussion of climate impacts, we wanted the people who were not climate experts to be comfortable and to stay in the conversation. So we talked about development drivers and then the things that disrupt development. And the first thing that came up was the economic crisis and the fact that tourists from the US and from the region and from Europe weren't coming. But that was because of the financial crisis, but also because of the uncertainty of a changing hurricane season and of drought and flood. So there were climate components. So we took a systematic view and a systemic view of how climate was impinging on the things that really matter in the countries we were working with. And then we had this wonderful exchange back and forth across the big table that we were at. And I don't remember which country brought it up, but somebody said, you know, our problem is we build on the beach, we have a big storm, everything gets knocked down, and we go back and we do it again, and we start over, and we're just stuck in this loop. Yes, it's not unique to the Caribbean or to islands. And so they said, what we need zoning laws, and we need them to be enforced. And somebody said, no, we already have them, we just don't enforce them. And so they said, okay, so what we need from aid is support for helping the decision makers in the islands to understand that they need to enforce zoning codes and why. And then someone else said, that's not enough. As soon as we have an election, somebody's going to campaign on being the person who will bring back the right to build on the beach. So we need community awareness as well as decision maker awareness. And somebody else said, yeah, but we, except for hurricanes, we don't have good information. We get the information on hurricanes from Miami. So we need better information because our only problem isn't hurricanes. We have drought, we have non-hurricane related floods, and we don't have good information. So we also need information. We need a better understanding of what to do with it when we get it. And then somebody else who fortunately, given that Ambassador Friday is here, I don't remember who said this or which country they were from, but they said, we need to move on to a new generation of decision makers because this generation, I'm not talking about you, just they're not getting it. So that led to a program at the University of the West Indies to train, we ended up funding about 20 master's and PhD students, and I think AusAid came in and funded another 15 to 20. But we created a curriculum at the University of the West Indies that linked societal benefit to climate change and climate science. And one of Grenada's new stars, one of the negotiating team is a graduate of this program. And that linkage is kind of how I got drawn into working in Grenada. And then the last thing they said was, we also need to get out and we need to try stuff. We need to see what works. And if it works, then we need to scale it up elsewhere. And so the program that AID put together for the region evolved into about I think it was a 12-part television series on climate change and its impacts, trainings for decision makers in multiple islands. And all of this was done with collaboration among the islands, coordinated by the Organization for East Caribbean States. The support to the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which I'll come back to in a minute, the master's program, and then scaling up. And I learned so much working there on, I don't think this would have come if we had started with climate. It came because we started we started the discussion with what matters for development and the economies of the region, and then how does climate impinge on those things, and how does that fit in with the many other impediments that you face? So I took that mindset and we worked in Jamaica, and I've definitely talked a lot about this, and I won't go into too much detail on this, but thinking about that development first mentality, Jamaica has a nice, it's called Vision 2030. It's a development strategy for the island. We wanted to get climate woven into the different components of the development strategy. Jamaica had been stuck, and again, not a unique problem to the Caribbean or anywhere. They had multiple competing climate strategies, and there was no one sort of breaking the tie among these different actors. So the Prime Minister asked if AID and the development community would help Jamaica come up with a new climate policy. And we did a workshop that was modeled on the work we had done in the East Caribbean, where we brought multiple stakeholders, multiple decision makers from across the government and civil society together, and again, talked about development drivers and climate impacts on those things. And Jamaica decided that their climate policy would be driven not from the top down, but by 26 focal points across the government. And they're going to start, or they are starting with, they're, I think, fairly well underway, 12 climate sector policies that will address climate risks. And those climate sector policies will be owned by the relevant ministries, not by the climate department. So it's no longer the environment ministry trying to tell other more powerful ministries what they have to do to build resilience, but the sector ministries taking ownership and looking to the climate ministry or climate department for support. It's looking at mitigation and adaptation. And there's a focus on bringing science and information in to inform this planning. Something that grew out of this was, again, information. We realized that the Weather Service in Jamaica was not well connected to the components of the government and of the economy that needed information. So we began talking with the Weather Service and its clients about where could they provide support. And we did, again, a multi-stakeholder workshop. It was agreed by these multiple groups that farmers didn't have access to information writ large, but particularly they were kind of caught off guard by drought. They'd realized when they were in the middle of the drought, but they didn't know that one was coming. And so we worked between the Met Service and the Weather Service and the Ag Extension Service to help them develop a seasonal drought forecast. There was a 30% decline across the island from 2013 to 2014 with the El Nino-driven drought. And the drought tool came online as the El Nino was taking shape. The way the tool looked was, it combined a backward look at how dry it's been and a forward look at what's expected in terms of rainfall, and communicated it through farmer forums and through text messages. And we found that it had a noticeable difference among farmers who used it. Farmers that were self-categorized as being at high risk of drought or weather-related impacts. Farmers in that category overall lost about 70% of production from 2013 to 2014. Those who used the tool cut those losses to in the neighborhood of 35 to 45%. So it had a substantial benefit. We reached 600 farmers. We think maybe 200 to 300 were actively using it. But while we were presenting, while the Jamaicans were presenting this at a regional, actually at a global workshop on weather and climate services, a guy from the CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, whom we've been working with through the regional work, jumped up in the middle of the presentation and said, just interrupted the guy from the Weather Service, the Jamaican Weather Service, and said, I need this for the whole region. This will be useful. We've got to have it. You've got to share. So we work with them to scale it up. And so in Jamaica, it was directly reaching about 600 farmers. Through the Ag Extension Service, might have been getting to 800,000 farmers. But when it got to the regional organization, who then fed the information back out to NADMO's National Disaster Management Organizations or offices, and water authorities and Ag Extension region-wide, we were suddenly reaching about 39 million people. And the information coming out of the forecast, out of the seasonal forecast, was used in Jamaica and elsewhere during the El Nino for water rationing warnings, for informing health services that there was a lower probability of malaria and mosquito-borne problems and a higher probability of problems associated with heat and drought than in normal years. At a subsequent workshop, Central America learned from the regional organization about it, and they have adopted it, and this was without aid being involved at all. So now we're reaching 42 million in Central America, so we're out of the islands. And then, oh, there's the growth. We had been working on creating some exchanges between Jamaica and Uruguay. And Uruguay has done some interesting work tying drought relief payments to soil moisture data so that they're paying people who are actually suffering. And when we connected the Uruguayans and the Jamaicans are now looking how they can adopt this. And they're taking lessons back from Uruguay to Jamaica on how to use the soil moisture data that's available from satellites. And hopefully that will then ripple back through that path. And what we'd like to see now is that we get beyond the Americas and into the Pacific and into the wider world. So we had this challenge that everyone's talked about of how do you produce this coordination and how do you sort of systematize sharing of lessons. So we realized that USAID and the US are working on NAP support, National Adaptation Planning support. We realized that the Germans, the Japanese, the Brits, the French are working on this. And that we could all do it in parallel, and we'd run the risk of going in and doing multiple vulnerability assessments, one after another, or we could coordinate. And so particularly with the UK, Germany, and Japan, we decided to form this NAP Global Network, also with a number of developing countries. We did not do this on our own. Here's some background on it. We launched it in Lima. We've kind of hit our stride. We now have 2 cohorts of countries that are sharing lessons on, among each other primarily, on how do you launch your NAP process and how do you move from high-level planning to finance. Oops. And next week, Roger Mark and I will be at a NAP network event in Grenada, where Grenada will be sharing with about 8 countries from the region the work that Grenada has done on developing its national adaptation plan. Someone from Jamaica is coming in to share lessons from Jamaica. And the other countries that are participating are at different stages of developing their NAP process. And so we hope to see that lessons, that what Grenada has tried and succeeded in, and what Grenada has tried and maybe not succeeded in, will help the other countries that are not as far along move more quickly and look at what's working in other places and draw it into their own processes. And I'll just say that we have about 18 countries participating in the 2 cohort training network that we have for the NAP Global Network, and about a third of them are small islands. And so again, in the network, as in the negotiation, small islands are playing an outsized role because again, they learn so quickly. I'll sum up by saying that it's been really rewarding for me to work, particularly in the Caribbean. Some of the things that the first panel or the earlier panel said about people knowing each other, that facilitates the flow of information. It lubricates the exchange of ideas. When the people you have to work with, you've known your whole life or for much of it, that level of trust that was brought up earlier can be there, and it really smooths things out. And it's been very rewarding for me to work and to help be one of the communicators of these lessons that we're finding and getting them out of the islands and into other areas. So thank you.
So we have about, I would say, 25 minutes to half an hour for general questions and discussions. And this was not planned in advance, but I thought I would ask the legendary Melinda Kimball whether she would care to make some remarks. So, microphone for Melinda.
It's coming over here.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for a great group of presentations. It was exciting to hear how the islands are cooperating. But maybe you could address how they're taking this fund that is now available, or even combinations of funds, and actually leveraging in either domestic or foreign investment to the bigger agenda of resilience and development.
Okay. Yeah, actually, having just been in the Caribbean at the combined meeting of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and the Caribbean Challenge Initiative Council, it's something that they're actually grappling with, the link to kind of the broader sustainability, sustainable development goals funding space, because I think when the Caribbean Challenge was first launched, which actually was in 2008 and then it was relaunched in 2013, they were really focused on conservation. As a start, that was a very conservation commitment, but as it's evolved very much because of the obvious reasons that we're all kind of talking about here. And so they're starting to think about what does this mean in terms of climate finance, in terms of how do they link it to what else is going on in their countries. And I think that is something that's been happening over the last couple of years. One of the things that they've really benefited from, it was actually the first meeting I've been at with governments and conservation people that's had someone from UBS give an investment forecast, which was really interesting. But they've benefited from having people like that, kind of really great technical advisors who are part of the process, helping them to think about how to invest their money. And some of the issues actually that they talked about in the meeting were that at the moment investment is really difficult in the space that they're working in. So some of their expectations for what they could make and what they could leverage is not there. I think the second piece is really the role of the combination of countries working together that really amplifies their voice. So, for example, in an upcoming meeting in Mexico, they're planning to have a conversation with donors together about how to invest in the work that they're doing. So instead of each country kind of talking separately, looking really at how they are a combined force, both from the fact that they're actually achieving what they've said they're going to do, but also that they're organising for, they're organising in a better way, I think, than doing it singularly. And I think that in itself is really exciting, but I don't think that they're starting to think about how to deal with these issues. We talked about it a lot during the council meeting and through the days. I think one of the interesting things actually about both of those meetings, I was actually sitting next to someone from tropical shipping. There were a lot of private sector people actually in the room. And their challenge, again, when the Caribbean Challenge Initiative was launched in 2013 and Ambassador Friday was there, there was actually at the same time a corporate compact which was going to look at the corporate sector. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned in that. I don't think it's been as impactful as they wanted, but they have a really clear idea of how to move forward. And so what's interesting at that meeting is that you had the private sector, you had governments, you had the trust fund people who are separate organisations all around the same table trying to solve these problems together. And I think from the idea of leveraging, that is part of that process. What does everyone bring to the table? So it was kind of exciting. So you had like people from Sandals and a whole range of others talking, talking in the microphones and sharing and asking questions. Because I think the Ambassador Friday and Ambassador Jumeau touched on it. It impacts on their tourism, it impacts on all sorts of things. There's a real recognition that we have to kind of address some of these issues. And I actually thought it was a very powerful kind of forward movement. They have a lot of room to grow there.
Shireen or John, do you want to add anything, or we go to the next question? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rubin. I'm a retired engineer, so I know something about systems. And when you're trying to control a system, the first thing you need is to know what you want that system to do. You want to know what you're trying to achieve. You have to define indicators you can measure and some sort of quality function so you can judge how well you're doing. And this is not necessarily, GDP is a terrible indicator of how well a country is doing. But most of what I heard today was about how to get funding for the islands, and especially with what Roger Mark mentioned about corruption, additional money may actually be counterproductive. It may actually do serious damage rather than help. Is anybody actually looking at this from the point of view of what you want these states to look, or what the people there want these states to look like when they're successful?
John.
Yeah, so with our work and with most countries' work as they develop their NAP, the starting point is, what are your development goals? Where are you trying to go? If the climate weren't changing and you could just pick a path and be on it, where would you be heading and how would you get there? And then let's identify where the climate is going to knock you off that path. And so in Jamaica, we started with their development strategy, their 20-year development strategy. And in the work we did in the East Caribbean and in, much farther afield, that tends to be the starting point. And then we come at the finance when they've identified the things they need to do, the interventions they need to make to try to keep them on that path. Then we bring in the discussion of finance and we look at blending domestic funding, bilateral aid, private sector, and multilateral investment funds. Because one of the things that countries realize is that they may not be calling their own investments adaptation, but they are investing in agriculture, water, energy, transportation. And it's really been interesting in the last year or so. A number of country representatives that I've been talking with have said, we're really realizing that we are spending our own money on this, and we need to get our own investments as resilient as possible, and bring the external money in to supplement and shore up what we're doing. So, from our perspective, the thing you're trying to achieve is the country's development goals as defined by the country.
I think that a lot of what people are talking about is not about finance per se, but it's really about the right finance going to the right place. So if you look at something like the Micronesia Conservation Trust, it's trying to deal with a lot of different issues. One is that about absorptive capacity of countries to take in these enormous amounts of money that we talk about regularly. We hear it in the climate change space, and actually get that down to community level, particularly in the Pacific, where that's where a lot of resource management action actually happens. So how do they kind of be a successful interlocutor in that? And I think the second part of that is how they, instead of everyone separately doing projects, how do they kind of have a better vision for what the country wants to do? And I think that's exactly what you're touching on. And then figure out how they're going to finance it, either domestically or from other sources of funding. And I also wanted to touch on, I think, a really good example of trying to do this, and it touches a little bit on the Caribbean, which is Hawaii. which has, with the Aloha Plus Challenge, they have a public-private partnership which is supporting the implementation of that. It's coordinating effort and really focused on measures. So there's been a process to figure out. There was a really great, I think, 2050 strategy on sustainability for Hawaii developed, but I think people are probably going to nod, but there was real concern that it wasn't going to be implemented. It's a problem with great policy and strategies is lack of implementation. So Hawaii actually has looked at that and brought together different sectors and all of the community that needs to have this discussion to come up with goals that they can actually commit together to implementing. And then they have, in the space of accountability, an online dashboard that you can actually go to and see how are they achieving those goals? What are their measures? And it will tell you that they're not achieving some things, that they are achieving some things need work. So the activity that we're doing in the Pacific with UNDP Small Grants Program is very much looking at the goal-setting measures space. How do you help figure out the goals? Because I think there's so many different plans and strategies in islands that they're trying to figure out how to implement. We kind of need to figure out how do those all come together. I think blue economy is one strategy to do that. And then how do we measure progress, both as a person living in an island and someone looking at it from the outside? How do we measure real progress? How do we see real progress is happening? And then it helps people understand where they can invest and put attention to in places where things aren't happening.
Great. Right in the middle.
Thank you all very much. My name is Sam Teicher. I'm the co-founder of Coral Vita. It's a company that's growing climate change resilient corals to restore dying reefs. And on the subject of trust and measurement, I think it's critical, Kate, to your point, that we need to know what progress is being achieved for enforcement, for monitoring, and also to build that trust amongst people. So in an ideal world, but also realizing that we're living in a real world, what measurements, what indicators would you like, and this is to everyone, would you like to see put in place that currently aren't being used either at a local level, national level, by World Bank to sort of measure that progress so that we can really advance actionable goals?
Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I think I can touch on that. I don't have the solution, but I think it has to be something from the island itself. I don't think it's particularly useful to have external measures developed by someone else for how an island is achieving anything. But I think what we've really been touching on here is that islands can learn from each other and figure out how to do that. In our partnership, actually, we have a whole work area on sustainability. We ask islands to define the integrity of that term for themselves. We don't say what that means, because I think we'll get into an endless negotiation for probably the next 10 years. So very much I think I would encourage us to think about how can we help an island figure out what the right measures are for it to achieve its success. And I think it touches on the gentleman that spoke before you. I don't know if...
Shireen?
I would just add that I think this is an incredibly hard and difficult topic, and completely agree with Kate's point that an individual community-based, subnational or national approach to resilience indicators has to be the way to go. I was part of the process around the 13th Sustainable Development Goal, 13.1, and trying to figure out what the appropriate proxy indicators for measuring increases in resilience would be. And the discussion ranged from, number of countries with NAPs, national adaptation planning processes, or number of people in a country that have been, that are covered by early warning systems, or by, number of people displaced in a post-disaster situation. And I think these are all incredibly valuable. And if you're trying to get a sense of global resilience, that's probably as close as you can get. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily tell you very much that if a country has a NAPS, what does that actually tell you about their level of resilience? Perhaps not much. Just all to say that I think having indicators that makes sense for the local context has to be the way to go.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Over there, please.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this panel. I'm actually from a Caribbean island called St. Martin, and I wasn't here for the beginning of this lecture, but I just wanted to shed some light as a youth from there. I'm very interested in climate change resilience, particularly because my island is very susceptible to the changes that this poses, and very little work is being done there, especially from the top down. Political corruptness is a very real thing, and right now there's just been this huge development on the coastlines of this $1 million project for hotels. And it's like we've learned a lot from past hurricanes, etc. So I think I was wanting to know if there's been any particular case study on St. Martin in specific, because it is divided into two different nationalities. It's half French and half Dutch. So there's not only working it from a very touristic perspective on both sides, but there are two different cultural aspects that you're dealing with, two different governments that you're dealing with. You're dealing with the territory of France, then the territory of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so there's a Dutch-Caribbean alliance, but there's not much of a regional force from all the Caribbean nations. You spoke of the BVI, so they're doing something. I guess they're working with the Great Britain, etc. So I was just wondering if there was any insight on that, if you guys had any light to shed on that, based on the work that you guys have done.
John?
No, sadly, I don't have much. St. Martin falls into the cracks where USA does not work in the region. Because of the French and Dutch ties, we work in the, Haiti and the English-speaking Caribbean. And I don't even know how St. Martin is connected via CARICOM to any of these other networks. Okay, so that's the best thing that I can suggest, is that you come in. Clearly the islands are willing to share, but I think you'd have to connect through the French or Dutch aid, because we don't work there. I don't think the Brits work there. I don't know about Germany.
Yeah, actually, so I think two issues. One, corruption. I don't think any country in the world has solved that problem. There's corruption everywhere on everything. Yeah, and it's difficult to offer solutions to that. But on the issue of engagement, so our partnership, when it was formed, was deliberately formed not to be, we're apolitical. So actually, our colleague here from Curacao, who's from your region, is part of, somehow, we work together anyway. But I don't want to overstate. But the point is that there are some mechanisms for engaging and learning and sharing. Even the Caribbean Challenge Initiative is not politically focused. So British Virgin Islands is doing that just as British Virgin Islands, engaging and connecting both to us and to the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, because their leadership is very interested in being engaged and sharing and learning. There's also the Overseas Countries and Territories Association, which this gentleman here may be able to tell you a bit more about after. But they've been very active politically. We did an event with them last year in Paris in trying to raise the profile of the overseas countries and territories, outermost regions of Europe, of which St. Martin would fall into. And I've actually been to St. Martin. This is very beautiful. But yeah, so I think there's mechanisms. It may not be the same as everyone, and I think the funding mechanisms are different. It's a very common thing, but I think if you talk to Javier from Curacao, you might get some more sense of some of the other ways that you can engage, or St. Martin can engage.
Yes, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the panelists for the excellent presentations. I just wanted to, had a question which threads together some of the things that you've said, and a little bit with the former session as well on islands as innovations. And innovation centers, and Kate, you just sort of said that in your in your last presentation. We really need to look at how we can. A lot of that is happening already. Now, one of the things that Shireen was pointing out is that we need to have more regional coordination amongst the islands, and of course more donor coordination as part of that. So my question then would go to my colleague John at USAID. Could you envisage a scenario in which we were to have both regional coordination and donor coordination around the idea of islands as hotbeds of innovation, bringing in one public sector funding, but also working with some of the innovative ideas which could actually help islands to some extent to either leapfrog in terms of resilience or leapfrog in other areas of innovation that would help their economies grow and develop. I was talking to someone earlier who's a consultant at Tesla, for example. We shouldn't discount the idea of pushing and promoting electric cars as one way. In Grenada, 50% of our fuel bill is for transportation. And of course, we can do a lot more and much more quickly in the policy space and in terms of showing how these things can work on islands. We just heard from someone on doing some coral research. And we know that, and this is to Melinda's question and to one of the points made earlier, the private sector is already engaged on this. In Punta Cana, for example, they're doing a lot of this coral work to not only save money and enhance their tourism product, but it's actually helping them attract more tourists, get more investment into the island, and so forth. So, how can we get people? How can we get this meme going that it makes sense to use the islands, for those purposes, to help them to leapfrog and get away from traditional pathways for development onto some new pathways which totally decouple, carbon emissions and all the other problems we have from development. Would you envisage USAID, for example, being prepared to work with other donors to help get this type of idea off the ground and to use your convening power to really make a difference in this regard? Because I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but just if Grenada were to, say to Tesla, look, we're putting our hands up, I'm sure they've got millions of other things to do, but I think if we did it as perhaps a regional effort, a corporation like Tesla could say, actually, yeah, that makes sense. Let's take a look at that. And that's just one small example. We could look at all aspects of renewable energy and, new things happening in resilience on mangrove restoration and all of these things. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
So I think it's a very interesting idea. And on a certain level, the NAP Global Network was an all countries effort at driving donor coordination and country coordination, so that we could short circuit some of the learning and do a lot of the things you talked about. I think it's a very interesting idea to focus on islands. I would have to go back and talk to my various colleagues about both within aid and then in the other development agencies about what we might do there. To your point about electric cars and Tesla and solar power, our regional mission in Barbados has been talking with, I don't know where it's going, but there's a small company that's importing electric cars to Barbados, mostly Nissan Leafs. They were bringing in a few of the little BMWs. They were also installing solar panels for charging stations. I think it would be, my own personal view is I think it would be really cool if Barbados or Grenada or somewhere else could say we are the first either completely all-electric transportation island country, or our entire taxi fleet or our entire public transit system is all electric, and get support from one of the electric car manufacturers to make this happen, that walks you back up into the regulatory environment. And the price of electricity that Shireen mentioned in the Pacific, it's comparable in the Caribbean. There are impediments to both technological and policy impediments. I think it'd be wonderful to look into it. I have a colleague from one of our key bureaus in the back of the room. I'll talk with her and with others and see what the appetite would be within aid, and then we can talk with colleagues from other agencies. I think it's a cool idea, but I can't promise anything right now. And I think we would need your help pushing from the outside, just as the small islands, contributed so mightily to getting the Paris Accord.
So I think that's a wonderful upbeat way to begin to do the wrap up here. So we'll essentially do this in reverse order, and you've just performed wonderfully. So Kate.
Yeah, I think so I'm going to focus on hopeful things that I think what I really see, and I think it comes out of Paris, it comes out of all these efforts globally of islands working together, is that there is an enormous amount of trust and partnerships and relationships built between islands, regardless of their political status. I think that's really important moving forward because, for example, in Hawaii, there was an agreement signed between Okinawa, Jeju, and the state of Hawaii on a global Green Island Summit. So you have kind of these islands associated with major economies starting to say, we're islands, we need to be thought of differently, let's figure that out. One of the parts of that agreement actually was that they would consider joining our partnership as well, so that we don't create another global initiative on islands. But I think the point is that's really helpful to us in terms of driving change in some of the larger countries, but also in helping to raise the profile of islands. And so I think that's really hopeful that we start to see people coming to the same conclusion and trying to work together, and that there's a lot of work that's been done to build those relationships for years, and we need to keep kind of moving forward and sharpen what it is we try to do together.
Great. Shireen.
Thanks, Tom. I guess I would just close by saying that we've had, I think, 8 or 9 speakers today, all touching on relatively different aspects of this question of SIDS leadership and SIDS as incubators. And it just goes to prove in how many different ways SIDS have really stepped up and taken this leadership role. And so I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation about how we can find opportunities to learn from SIDS and to scale up the good practices that they've been developing. And GLISPA is certainly one of the avenues for doing that, and just to continue the conversation. Thanks.
Great. So I'd also like to thank Roger Mark, who in one sense is the personification of the entire afternoon's subject matter, and who put a great deal into crafting an extraordinary program. So please join me in thanking Roger Mark and this great panel.